my name is Anastasiya Obraztsova. I'm 27 years old. I'm currently an inside sales consultant with a printing and marketing company. And a fun fact about me is that I speak 3 languages fluently. I speak Russian, French, and English. So my family came from Kazakhstan. My mom's side of the family was originally from Russia, but my parents and I have mainly lived in Kazakhstan with most of our family. And it's in the south of Kazakhstan, so in a town called Shymkent. So it's almost on the border with Uzbekistan. And we decided to immigrate to Canada. So generally, as a pretty big reason for, I think, many people immigrating is in being in search of a better life and better conditions of life, more opportunities, whether that's for yourself or your children or, your children's children, essentially. And we kind of chose Canada, I guess, compared to other places, mainly because at the time Canada did offer an immigration program. So it was pretty popular and well publicized, and it seemed like a good place to live with lots of opportunities. We also, my dad knew some English, so it was a good place to go where he'd be able to speak the language of the country. We also heard a lot of good things about Canada. It was one of the top countries at the time in terms of quality of life and economy and various other aspects of life. It was seen as a very safe country with quite a bit of economic stability. So these were some of the, I guess, high level reasons for us to move to Canada specifically. And I'm pretty sure it's still ongoing, but basically Canada was looking to get more and more people into the country in order to, I guess, promote general development, economic development, promote some diversity, get more people into the country and participating in all of the different opportunities. And so Canada, in a lot of ways, is a much more kind of stable and developed country than Kazakhstan was, at least at the time. So, and not a lot of countries have immigration programs. So contrary to some popular belief, you can't just up and immigrate into any country in the world that you choose to go to. You actually have to get there through an immigration program, typically, if it's not like a temporary visa or something like that. So Canada had a program and anybody could apply. So unlike the States where it's a bit of like a lottery, for example, in Canada, you could just apply. And obviously it was conditional. So there was no guarantee that you would get accepted. So it's almost like an interview. You have to go through documents and questions and interviews and checkups. And then if you're successful, then you get to immigrate. Yeah, so as I had kind of mentioned earlier, we did not move to Burlington originally, although we did originally land in Ontario. So we landed in Richmond Hill in hopes of my dad locating a job there, and it was an Anglophone province, so in Ontario. I was more so Anglophone and my dad spoke English, so it seemed like a good spot to be. And it was very close to Toronto, which had a very big Russian-speaking community. But after a year of being there, my dad could not find any work. So he ended up getting a job in the same company he worked in back in Kazakhstan, but their offices were in Montreal. So we moved to Montreal for a bit. And while he had the job, and we stayed there for a fairly long time. And then eventually his department was being shut down. So he had to find a new position, and he ended up finding one again in the same company, but he was changed over to the Mississauga office, so again in Ontario. And so my parents decided that they needed to move there, and they were trying to find a community that was close to my dad's work, but that was also a great community to grow a family. And so Burlington came about. Burlington is very similar to the community we used to live in back in Montreal. It's very peaceful, very quiet. It was at the time and still is one of the best kind of mid-sized cities to live in Ontario generally, and even more so in Canada as well. It was a fairly affordable neighborhood for us. It's very green. It has everything that you would need to grow a family. And so at the time, so back in Montreal, my brother and sister were born, so my little siblings. So our family did grow. And then my grandmother came to join us as well from Kazakhstan. So Burlington seemed like a great place to cater to all of our different generations living in one house and to all of our different needs. So yeah, that's one of the reasons that my parents, or few of the reasons that my parents chose it. And they've been very happy with the choice so far. And I've enjoyed living in Burlington the 7 years that I did. So unlike Kazakhstan, Canada has a lot of different services and activities. Everything is very much created for the population to be happy, whether that's playgrounds or movie theaters or libraries. Everything is very kind of open and free and accessible. Like the museum that you guys are a part of, there's a lot of different things to do for different audiences, and that's not something we had before back in Kazakhstan. So that's what we were really hoping to achieve, is to come to a place where we could really grow and use our full potential and not be restricted by, I guess, the government and regulations and the lack of kind of opportunities for even everyday life back in Kazakhstan. Job. So it is a fairly long and a bit of a tedious process in some ways. So there's a lot of documents to fill in that are very multi-step. There's often a lot of, there's different checks to be done. My parents have had to travel abroad in order to do interviews. So they had to be personally interviewed to be assessed on what kind of individuals they are. So they actually had to, at one point, go to Poland to do an interview. There's also it involves a lot of waiting. So much like applying anywhere and waiting for documents to come back. Maybe you need to get some documents notarized or anything like that. So you're waiting on different people. And then some of the difficulties that they encounter was that there was delays from the embassy. And then there was also that uncertainty, as I mentioned, of will we even get selected? Because obviously all of this is conditional. There's no guarantee that you'll make it at the end of it. So that was it's that kind of uncertainty and not really knowing if there's going to be the outcome you're looking for at the end of the process. Well, as you can imagine, it was a big cultural shock. So that's the main thing that I can kind of notice. So yeah, cultural and lifestyle shock. Canada is very different from Kazakhstan in pretty much every respect. Also, we had moved to what was essentially like a city or a bigger city. I mean, Richmond Hill isn't the size of Toronto necessarily, but it was still much bigger than the town that we used to live in back in Kazakhstan. There was way more urban development in kind of the cities, and their layouts were way more advanced in their structuring and their planning than Kazakhstan was. The climate was very striking for us, very different. And we were also struck by the fact that people were very friendly and generous. So that's not really something that's part of the Kazakh culture. And when I say that, I mean more so like strangers, because here you can be walking outside and somebody sees you and they smile and they say hi. So that wasn't something that was part of our lives back in Kazakhstan. For myself, I think the shock or the stress of the move, the kind of like acknowledging it caught up to me a little bit later. But even myself, I was certainly like, there was a lot of confusion, and I do remember there's been a fair amount of times where I was sad, not necessarily homesick, but just like when I started school, for example, I landed full on into a regular English speaking class. So I was the only kid pretty much who didn't speak any English, and nobody around me really spoke my language. So I kind of had to and on top of it, you're adjusting to a very different lifestyle and surroundings. So it was definitely kind of stressful, but I think my parents did their best to alleviate some of that for me, for sure. Yeah, I mean, when we first arrived, my mom kind of mostly stayed home. She did eventually go and take English lessons at like an adult kind of ESL type school. And for myself, once I started in that classroom, I was assigned to a special teacher that would help students like me, because as it turned out, I was not the only immigrant in the classroom. There was a couple of other kids like me who came from other countries and that didn't really speak English. And so to offer us extra support, we would spend a couple days a week with that teacher, kind of one-on-one, and do kind of more intense exercises. She would give us things to do at home as well to practice, just to be able to improve our language skills. And then it was similar when we moved to Montreal. So in Montreal, I had to learn how to speak French, but there they have welcome classes, which is again for immigrant children who don't know the language. And so you basically, in that class, you don't really do other school subjects other than the language itself and math. So that's all you do usually during the year. And once you're done that year, you'll go back into the regular grade that you were supposed to go into. So there were some definitely different kind of elements like that in school for kids in place. And then for, like, my dad already spoke English, so he worked. And then my mom, she just went to schools for adults who are learning English as like a second language. So she took some classes there, and she was there kind of the whole day, kind of like any other school, really. Yeah, I think it's like leaving any place, and I think everybody can identify with the feeling of just moving from one place to another. But it's just leaving a familiar lifestyle behind. So familiar lifestyle, familiar places, leaving friends and family, and having a lot of unknowns ahead of you. And unlike a move that would have been close by, like if we had moved to the next city over or the next street over, we were moving all the way overseas. So it's not like we can just come back at our leisure and visit our family in our old hometown whenever we wanted. So those were kind of the main difficulties. And yeah, a lot of unknown. So at the time, unlike today, there was barely any social media, and the internet was like, it was going, but it was definitely not as developed and as diverse as it is today. So we didn't have the resources like we would have today to be able to find out like about the country and about what's going on in it, and how we can to have that preparation in advance about what to expect. So it was just kind of like, jumping off a cliff into a lake, but you don't know what's in the lake. Is there rocks? Is it deep? Is it shallow? Right? Like you just kind of go for it. So those would be the tough parts, the familiarity of everything, and then not knowing what's ahead. So one of the people originally that was helpful, it was sort of like a consultant / kind of paralegal assistant. It was this kind of nice lady, and she helped my parents with some of that application process for immigration, and then she helped us kind of get settled upon arrival and connect us to sort of like the landlady we ended up living with, and then some of the locals, so we would at least have some basics about who we could turn to and who we could ask questions. And then for my parents, generally, it's a variety of different, my dad called them little people, or maybe people that are not necessarily occupying any particular huge role, but people that were just nice. So as we said, like, we were really surprised by how kind and generous people are here without being asked, and they're kind to strangers. So it was everything from having a grocery store worker be kind enough to show you, what aisle your food items are in or how the store is organized, to like, maybe a bus driver kind of explaining how to use like the transit cards. My dad was really fortunate when he was looking for work. There was a lady at the organization he was going to that went the extra mile when she was giving all of her kind of lectures and classes, to give him the support he needed. And then in my particular case, especially originally, it was my teacher, actually, my grade 2 teacher. She was extremely supportive and she made me feel comfortable. So even despite our language barrier, I could tell that she was very kind. And she did give me a lot of like close attention, that not a lot of teachers would take the time and energy necessarily to, focus away from the rest of the class and make sure you were settled. And so she helped me adapt much faster and integrate into the classroom without feeling left out. So those were really like the first kind of people and touch points for us that were really, really helpful. I think the biggest thing for us is it made us much more open-minded, and particularly open-minded with regards to different like people and different cultures. So we had been exposed to cultural diversity in Kazakhstan, somewhat, but still a bit more homogenous and still a bit more kind of in terms of certain values and people viewing things a certain way. But coming to Canada really changed our perspective on different people, and I guess a bit of an optimistic view on that, like different cultures can coexist kind of harmoniously and can kind of learn from each other and benefit from it. So yeah, there was of course some things that were shocking. Like I remember even like, seeing people look a certain way that I was like, oh my God, like for example, like I probably had never seen like an Indian person in my life, right? Or people from some other countries that I just never fathomed. But here they were, like some of them were in my classroom in grade 2. So I was like, oh, like what are all these people? So I think it really opened our mind to everything that there is in the world. And then for me personally, I think it kind of changed my sense of like identity. Like I guess as a little kid, like I'd probably be, oh, I'm like a little Russian kid from Kazakhstan. But then over time moving to Canada, I developed a much different sense of who I am. Now I feel like I kind of embody a variety of different cultures. And it changed a lot as well, my sense of curiosity. So I'm a much more curious and eager to learn kind of person than I think I would have been if we had stayed back in Kazakhstan. So it's kind of created this like multifaceted, I guess, being for myself. So yeah, so kind of being more open-minded and in tune with that, kind of developing a sort of a multi-sided identity for me personally. Like for example, for us, like we didn't really celebrate Christmas. We would get presents on New Year's. New Year's was the big holiday, and that's when you would get presents from Santa. So originally when we first moved, that's what we had started by doing. But then with school, everybody was like, oh, Christmas. So then I came home and I was like, I want presents on Christmas too. But it remains that for us, New Year's is a very big holiday. A lot of people here will just kind of, go out, wait until midnight and go to bed or whatever. But for us, it really is a time for kind of gathering with the family and having fun. So there's some holiday celebrations, and then food definitely. And especially with like my grandma living with us and stuff. So we do a lot of cooking of a lot of different dishes that are mostly either kind of Central Asian or Russian or Eastern European generally. And we did our best to locate some stores with some European food. So we do buy a lot of those kind of food items that are familiar to us. And that's usually always fun and exciting. We still watch shows and listen to music. that we can take from kind of, Russian artists or Russian speaking artists. So kind of like what we used to watch or listen to. So there's still a lot of kind of those elements that remain in the family. And I find often when people ask me like, oh, like, are you Russian? Or like, who do you identify as? Like, do you identify as Canadian or Russian? And I often just tell people I identify as multicultural. I don't really identify as one or the other, because I enjoy being with Spanish speakers because I learned Spanish in high school and I thought that was very fun. And I used to take like Latin dancing. So I really loved kind of that whole Hispanophone community. And then a lot of nostalgia for Quebec where we used to live, and then a lot of Anglophone stuff, but also a lot of nostalgia for, I guess, Russian culture and elements. So I'd say, yeah, it became very kind of fused and multifaceted. And then in terms of kind of developing any new traditions with my family, well, we certainly adopted some holidays and celebrations that we didn't used to do. Again, Christmas being an example, and even Easter. Like we have Orthodox Easter, but we didn't like really celebrate it per se. And Orthodox Easter is celebrated kind of differently as well. So this whole like Easter bunny chocolate egg hunt situation was not really part of that. But I brought a lot of those things from school, and we ended up adopting them. And then so also like attending festivals and cultural events. That's not really, I guess, something we did a lot of, but then over time we started to kind of enjoy that more so. So we would kind of make an effort to go out and participate in those. So I'd say like that's kind of like some of the newer traditions that we've developed or took on. Pretty much just pictures. We did bring photo albums with us, but they don't really, I guess that was just pictures that we took back there. But then as we moved, my parents fairly quickly wanted to get their hands on a digital camera, because back then we only ever used like those disposable film cameras. So they got their hands on like a small digital camera, and that kind of became a big part of our life for quite a few years, because it was a way for us to kind of document it for ourselves, because like I said, it was especially to me, I was a kid, so I wasn't like, obviously I was in awe, but you don't experience these things the same. Like to me, I was kind of like, oh yeah, everything looks different, but like whatever, I'm just gonna, play or go to school. But for my parents, it was like, oh my God, like the trees look different, the streets look different, the cars look different, right? So they really wanted to, I think, document it for themselves, like their experience of it, but also very much so to share it with family back home. So with my dad's mom, who now lives with us, and then with like my uncle's family, so my dad's brother. So a lot of those photos would get sent over to them so that they can kind of experience this with us and understand what we're seeing and what we're doing. So that's really just it. We didn't really bring any, my family's not really big on heirlooms or mementos or things like that. So we didn't really bring anything over. But yeah, photos are a big one. Yeah, well, so, I mean, again, originally, like when we had moved to Richmond Hill, my dad was volunteering for the Heart and Stroke Foundation. So volunteering is one of the bigger ways here of being able to not only integrate into the community, but get the skills that you need to get a job and advance professionally. So that's something that he was doing. And then after he got a job, and my mom was mostly a stay-at-home mom because I was little and then my little siblings were born. So she was mostly always home and always had her hands kind of full. But she did participate in when I was like in a lot of, I guess, our extracurriculars or school-related stuff. So when I was dancing, she was a very big part of that. She was making a lot of the costumes. She attended pretty much all of my concerts, and she was heavily kind of involved in that. And then when my siblings were little, she would kind of help out at sometimes some like school or kindergarten, like little sales and fairs and things like that. But I think overall at this point, like after like my dad got a job and my mom was mostly home, once I started kind of late elementary into high school and all that, I've been kind of the volunteer expert in the family. I've been mostly involved in the community pretty much everywhere that I was. Anything from tutoring other students at the schools I was at. In Montreal, I volunteered at the local library for a while. And yeah, often in schools with any kind of events, programs, tutoring, did a lot of that. In my dance troupe, I would help out a lot as well with really anything, everything from announcing during shows to helping rehearse with the little kids or things like that. And then specifically in connection to Burlington. So settling in Ontario was again like a big move for us because we had lived in Quebec for 11 years. So moving to Ontario was not necessarily like immigrating, but it almost kind of was because it's still quite different. So I immediately turned to volunteering because I guess answer the second part of the question, I think it's extremely helpful with settling because it provides a stress-free environment. It's not like a job where you have to like meet expectations, meet quota, like fill your hours and all that. And you're not looking to get paid. You're just looking to kind of do something you enjoy and give back. So I think volunteering, that's why I immediately like Ireland House was the first place I went to when we moved to Ontario, because like I liked museums and stuff, but it really helped me get to know the community I was living in because you're constantly interacting with locals and you interact with people of different ages. So you get to know about, okay, what are young people doing? What are older people doing? So I could bring that information home and kind of tell my parents and my grandma and my siblings, right? And then it helps give you something to do. So you kind of feel like your days, if you're not too busy or if you don't have a job yet, you can fill them with something. You can make friends or at least acquaintances that you can turn to. You meet different people who have different professions, who know different things in the city. So it really helps you kind of adapt. It gives you a purpose, like it makes you feel less lonely. And I often found that for myself personally, when I'm busy kind of helping other people, it helps take my mind off things. Like if I'm feeling kind of sad or anxious or whatever, I find that volunteering in that way has always been very fulfilling. So yeah, I would say that I was kind of mostly part of that. Like in Burlington, I was in the museums, I was in the Performing Arts Center, and a couple of little one-time initiatives like with the city parades and things like that, the Sound of Music Festival. So yeah, and I think being part of like these kind of community organizations and initiatives, especially on a volunteer basis, really helps you integrate kind of faster and more genuinely into the community than simply like getting a job or going to school. It's definitely very nice, I think. Yeah, well, I mean, I guess the biggest one, and now that it's available, is do your research. That would be my biggest thing. So moving or like immigrating in general, moving, even if you're moving, just changing cities, that's the best way that you can help yourself be as prepared as you can be and to avoid any unnecessary kind of stress or kind of unmet expectations is to really research where you're going. So what is the place like? What's available there? What are the services? What's the economy like? What do things cost? Kind of the job market, right? Like how it's organized. If you have children, right? What are the schools? What's the education system like? What's the health system like? Pretty much anything that's new to you or could be new to you, so that you don't, like I said, come and have all these needs or expectations and all of a sudden they can't be met for whatever reason. And then another big thing I would suggest is to learn the language of where you're going. And it doesn't have to be learn it like to a level of high proficiency, but at least to get some sense or some kind of conversational level of understanding, because it will help you orient yourself. And especially if you don't have any kind of friends or family or other resources to help you, you'll at least be able to navigate your way and at least be able to get yourself into a school or something again to keep learning the language. But then all that being said, despite all of this kind of effort and stuff, it's very much worth it. So there will be challenges regardless, but once you get all that preparation and all that effort, it really is kind of worth it as long as you remain kind of resilient and that. And I guess the third biggest tip would be to be open-minded, because especially if you're moving to a completely new country, like people can be completely different, things will be completely different. So just being patient with that and accepting that as like part of the process, and I guess embracing it even. For sure. So a first big one I would say is the high cost of living. At least in some of the major, I guess, urban hubs that immigrants tend to gravitate towards, or maybe some urban hubs that tend to be, I guess, advertised or publicized a bit more frequently. So kind of bigger cities like Vancouver and Montreal and Toronto. So definitely a big challenge to find a place that's affordable, especially as an immigrant when you don't necessarily have a source of income or a steady source of income to rely on. Another challenge I think would be getting a job, or competition for different things in general. Like you had mentioned wait times in different places, but yeah, so in terms of like the job market, especially again in big urban centers, there are a lot of people and there are a lot of people looking for jobs. So you kind of apply, and if, you know, instead of being 50 candidates, now there's like 1,000 of you. So harder to kind of get a job. And then especially if you're kind of starting from the bottom, it may be harder for you to kind of get somewhere in the top. And then it might be a bit of a kind of like a rude awakening for if you used to have a job in your home country where you were at a fairly high level, and now moving to a new country, you have to kind of start sometimes completely at the bottom or completely shift paths. So that's the challenge. And then competition more generally. So again, just for different services, sometimes putting your kids in school can be challenging because all the spots may be full, and other things like that. And then the third one I would say is in some ways fitting in, which might seem to be a bit, I guess, contrary to like things I've been saying throughout the interview, but I think even since we moved, the immigrant population has grown a very considerable way. And I would say not only has it grown in the size of the immigrant population, but also in its diversity. And that's not to say that that's a bad thing by any means, but it just means that there's a lot more different cultures intermingling. So Canada is, I would say, way less homogenous than it was than when even we moved there 20 years ago. So it's about kind of navigating that sometimes and being able to, so it's like now, like, you know, as a Russian person, now you're not only getting along with Canadian people, now you have to get along with maybe Asian people and African people and South American people. So it's being able to, again, be open-minded and acceptance. So not only are you trying to fit in this new country, but then there's all of these other cultural bubbles coexisting that you have to now be aware of, I think more so than when we had moved. But yeah, I would say those are like the main three. So the high cost of living, the competitiveness, particularly in the job market, and fitting in an increasingly diverse population. Yeah, I would say, I mean, just kind of the high level stuff. I think people essentially have the same goals for immigrating as we did. Or I mean, some of the goals may have shifted. Obviously, not everybody immigrates for the same reasons, but I think there's still quite a few immigrants today that move because they're in search of a better life, whatever reason that may be, whether it's just because your home country was not that great. Nowadays, the political climate has obviously shifted. A lot of people are trying to move or immigrate because there's a political conflict going on in their country. But I would say overall, it's in search for a better quality of life, in search of more freedom and better opportunities, which is why we left. And then I think a lot of similarity is also with the challenges and hardships people face. We've actually, with the Ukrainian conflict going on overseas, my parents have recently met quite a few Ukrainian immigrants and migrants in general, and like they face much of the same challenges and hardships that we faced when we moved. So everything from not speaking the language to not maybe having a lot of funds, navigating a completely different country with a completely different lifestyle. So I would say that really has never changed. The only changes might be like the access to information with the globalization of different things and the presence and the widespread of the internet. But yeah, other than that, I'd say same goals and same challenges. I definitely am kind of happy to be part of this project because I've never really, contemplated my immigration journey. And in a lot of ways, like, I wouldn't say that my immigration experience occupies like a huge part of my life. Like, it's not really something I think about to do often. And I don't consider that to be like a very necessarily a part of my identity that I necessarily feel the need to highlight to people. But it was nice to kind of participate in this and to, think how far we've come and how much different my life could have been, and it makes me really grateful. And and just the kind of looking back to ways that I've been able to help, even like at the museum when I was an educator and would meet sometimes some of those little kids that also move and experience immigration like I did. So it just makes me better equipped to and kind of better motivated to help people who have been through that. So yeah, I'd say it was a very nice kind of project to participate in, and I kind of look forward to seeing everybody else's contributions as well.